Thank you. Hello, everyone. So yeah, I don't need to reintroduce myself. Thank you for doing that. So yes, I work for a company called Particular Software. We are basically specialized in message-driven systems, and that's what I'm here also to talk to you a little bit about today. Now, a couple of years ago, my husband and I were looking at a new house because the previous house we were living in, it feels like it just shrunk as we had the kids. And we had this beautiful vision of, oh, we're gonna buy a big house. It's gonna have an amazing garden, and my husband will do the barbecues, and I will, cook my summer paella. Completely ignoring the fact that we live in Belgium and we don't get summers at all. But anyway, we ended up buying a house, and as it goes, when you have to get a mortgage, you go into 5, 6, 7 banks and start to ask them for a rate and then compare because of course, you don't just want to go with the first offer, right? So you want to see what is going to be the best thing for me long term. But that takes a huge amount of time, and it's always a hassle. I really hated that whole process. It took weeks. So an alternative is to use a loan broker service. And the way that that works is, as a customer, you come in and you make a request and you say, I would like to loan, 500,000 euros. I would like to be able to pay that off over 10, 15, 20 years, whatever makes sense for you. And I would like for my rate to be fixed, which might be a good idea in these interesting times. Now, at that point, the loan broker is going to ask us, well, great, pay us first, because nothing in life is for free, right? That's how it goes. So once we pay for the service, the loan broker will do a credit scoring exercise to figure out whether we would even be a solvable customer. Are we going to be able to pay back our mortgage, yes or no? Now, based on that credit score, they will also make a selection of the eligible banks. Now, that is important because not every bank works with any kind of customers. There are banks specialized to work with entrepreneurs or that only work with premium customers, right? So we want to also limit the amount of banks that we reach out to. Then we ask every of those banks for an offer. And some of them may get back to us with an offer and some of them may not, right? Of course, every bank works with their own data format and they're not going to adjust to our needs. So there's going to be some kind of a translation effort to basically make that data make sense within the boundaries of our system. And then we can start to sort of rank those results and give our customer the best offer that we have available. So looking at this sort of, whoa, this is turned around. People, you can tell me that. Oh no, it's looking good. I thought it was turned around with the whole sideways, but okay. Won't look back. I'll just look at you. But anyway, I decided to leverage a microservice architecture for this because, there's enough complexity involved here, many moving pieces. And one of the things that people say a lot is that, well, microservices are much more simpler because when you look at each individual service, it's a lot more concise, easy to comprehend, and easy to evolve on its own, right? But the thing is that the complexity hasn't really gone away. It hasn't disappeared. We have basically moved the complexity. And where has that complexity gone? Well, to the lines that we draw in between those services, basically the inter-service communication that is occurring across those services. Because when you think of an individual microservice, well, it doesn't provide much value, right? Because it's way too tiny to basically answer any kind of customer or business needs. It's only when we start to put them together into a larger sort of workflow, for example, that we start to see where that value basically comes from. And that's why it's important for us to start paying much more attention to how we draw those lines. How do we allow those services to communicate with each other? Now, if we have more complex workflows, there might be some coordination that is needed. And that's what we're here to talk about today, orchestration and choreography. Now, when we consider orchestration, we basically have a command-driven approach where there's a central component directing the flow and telling other services what it is that they need to do. It also acts as a state machine. What does that mean? That it will keep around any relevant state to that workflow, also to enable itself to make decisions on what needs to happen and when does that need to happen. And it will do so by directing other microservices that are part of the system to say, I want you to do this now. Now, of course, the microservice still has its own autonomy because it can decide how I'm going to do that, but there's another component basically directing the flow. In a choreographed approach, we have an event-driven approach, where basically there is no central component anymore. There's also no state machine. Basically, the state is gathered across all of the participating services. Each of one of them is just keeping around the state that is relevant to its own service. And individual services will decide what to subscribe to, whatever may be of interest to them. And based on that, they will decide what to do and when to do it. And that's about the only theory that we're going to see today, because I would like to take some examples from the banking domain, starting with our loan broker service, to sort of go through the comparisons between these two patterns. Now, first of all, let's just say that we're going to design this using a orchestrated approach, okay? So our user comes in, makes their request, and at that point, we'll get the payment, as we already said. Our orchestrator will also then make sure that the credit scoring is done based on those results. We'll then ask the quoting service to get, the eligible banks, get the quotes, and once we have them, the orchestrator will ask the ranking service to rank them. And that looks pretty great at first sight, right? Because it's pretty easy to understand. You can sort of understand the flow. You can see what's happening. The state is centralized in that orchestrator, and it's easy to comprehend. But as you might expect, this also has downsides. First of all, this approach requires all of those downstream services to be available. But what would happen if, let's say, credit scoring is down? Well, now our orchestrator needs to start caring about this, right? It needs to start implementing resilience patterns like retries or back-off retries or even circuit breakers and things like that. But what if the credit scoring service is unavailable for a couple of days? Then it might need some kind of backup service or something like that to deal with, right? What also stands out to me in this picture is that there's a whole lot of coupling in between that orchestrator and all of the downstream services. So in this specific example, the orchestrator is aware of 4 other services in the system. There's also a lot of communication going back and forth, right? And that can sometimes lead to high contention on the orchestrator, which might cause us to, consider things like, oh, we'll have to see how we can scale this thing. And that can be tricky because, of course, you want all of the communication that pertains to a single workflow instance to also go to the same orchestrating instance. So you might need to consider things like load balancers and stuff like that. And that starts to incredibly complicate your architecture and your infrastructure. And these are the types of sort of problems that lead to the idea that an orchestrator becomes the single point of failure. Because if that thing stops working, well, nothing can continue, right? Basically, your workflow is stuck. And it gets even worse, because let's consider that we want to add a step to this workflow. Our customers paid for a service, they also want an invoice. Okay, we add a component for that. Let's say that there's sufficient complexity involved, that it warrants that. But now we also have to go and change this orchestrator component to direct it to generate an invoice when it's appropriate, because we have an orchestrated approach. So we're changing 2 components to add 1 step. That's a lot to consider, right? There's a lot of complexity, a lot of things that you have to think about when you go for an approach like this. You know what? Let's do choreography. It's going to solve all of our problems. So in this case, the flow is exactly the same. It just looks very different because we've sort of, we now have that event-driven approach. So in this case, our payment service publishes an event which credit scoring subscribes to. Our quoting service will then react to the credit scoring being completed. And when we have our quotes available, the ranking service will rank them and publish, the most appropriate quote that we have available. Now, this addresses most of the downsides that we earlier saw with that orchestrated approach, because now we got rid of that tight coupling, because now there's an event bus in the middle. So if any of those individual components is down for a while, fine, the messages will wait on the broker until that component is back up. We also don't have a centralized component that may be suffering from these issues of other services being down, or also from that high contention. If we have an individual service that needs a little bit more juice, then we can go and scale that individual service without affecting the entire workflow or other components. And if we want to add a step to the workflow, well, easy peasy. We just introduce our new service as we did. We add an event subscription, and we do our thing, and that was that. Now, when you start to look at the advantages that a choreographed approach brings, there's always one thing that stands out to me, and that's this idea that, most of our coupling is actually kind of gone, right? But as all of us know, coupling is not something that you want to entirely get rid of, right? It's rather something that you want to balance, because a completely decoupled system is equal to an unoperable system. It doesn't do anything because it's not connecting to anything outside of itself, right? But when we look at our coordination mechanisms and we start thinking about coupling, then you might quickly conclude, orchestration, lots of coupling, choreography, much cleaner approach. But there's a big flaw in this assumption. We never ever talked about which types of coupling we're even referring to. Now, one of my friends is Italian. I appreciate him a lot. And if I would tell him, hey, all of these spoons, it's just all the same, right? It's just what? Water and some flour and eggs, therefore no difference. Well, we'd probably not be friends if I would say that. And I want you to think about coupling in exactly the same way. When someone says there's high coupling here or low coupling there, ask them what type of coupling are you referring to? Because there are different types of coupling and they each introduce different types of friction in the system. So differentiating that is really important. And I want to go back to basics, to the first type of coupling I was ever introduced to, which is afferent and efferent coupling. Who's ever heard of that before? Okay. So this actually dates back to when object-oriented programming was introduced, which makes me feel way too old, but anyway, where basically these terms were used to describe coupling in terms of class interactions. But we can reuse those same concepts and then apply them to how our services interact. So afferent or incoming coupling refers to all of the incoming connections, so all of the services that depend on you, so to speak. Whereas efferent coupling refers to outgoing coupling, all of the services that you as a service depend on and are calling in one way or another. Now, when you look at afferent and efferent coupling and you sort of map those to our coordination approaches, you will see that you have a lot more afferent or incoming coupling in a choreographed approach because you have all of those event subscriptions, right? Whereas in an orchestrated approach, you will see a lot more outgoing coupling because you have that orchestrator who has outgoing connections to all the downstream services. But again, this might lead again to this idea that, all the coupling is the same, but it is not. What I want to sort of show or hammer with this slide is that when we go from an orchestrated to a choreographed approach, or the other way around, we are not basically removing or adding coupling. What we're doing is we are reversing it, right? We are changing the direction of the arrow. If you would draw an architectural diagram, there's still an arrow. Now, one of the things that people sometimes say is, no, I don't have any coupling because I'm using an event broker or a message broker or whatever it is. But that's really not true, because if I'm a producer and I publish events, if I change that event contract, am I going to break all of my consumers? Yes, I am, right? So that event contract is going to have to evolve and consumers are going to have to change that. So there is coupling. Now, this statement can be true in the sense of temporal coupling. That's the type of coupling we get rid of when we switch to an asynchronous communication style, is that we don't have that hard dependency of this service needs to be live and available right now, because we have an event message or a message waiting on a broker until that service is available. Now, one of the things that I sort of saw when I started to get into messaging years and years and years ago was that there was this assumption that if you're orchestrating, you're using synchronous communication. And if you're doing choreography, then you have asynchronous communication. But it's important that we differentiate the coordination style, orchestration or choreography, from the communication style, which can be synchronous or asynchronous communication. And a perfectly valid approach is to use orchestration with asynchronous communication. So if we look at the same example, I'm not going to go over the flow again because it's the same. We will just see one thing that stands out is there are so many more arrows. And I suffered creating these slides. And it's for a reason, because I wanted to indicate that now, given that the communication is asynchronous, a request is one operation, it's one message. And a reply to that request is another message, right? So they're handled out of band. But this allows us to basically get rid of that temporal coupling. We don't have that tight surface dependency anymore because there's a message broker in the middle. Also, we still have that high contention. There's a lot of communication going back and forth through that orchestrator, so there's a lot of pressure on that component. However, there are queues in the middle. So if there's a lot of pressure, none of our requests will ever be lost. They will be safely stored in the queue until the orchestrator can pick them up, and that unlocks other scalability options, right? Makes it a little bit easier. So the whole idea of the orchestrator being a single point of failure is alleviated once we introduce asynchronous communication. So where does that bring us? Well, we got rid of temporal coupling with this asynchronous orchestrated approach, right? We also regained much flexibility in terms of our scaling, and we still have contract coupling. But we would have that in a choreographed approach as well, right? That's basically the event contract that travels on the wire. Both producer and consumer are kind of tied to that, or have to have a mutual understanding of what can be in there. We also still have control coupling, where there's one component telling other components what to do. Now, you could see this as a downside, but actually control coupling brings advantages, right? It gives us visibility into the process flow. There's probably a single class or a couple of classes that I can go into, read the code, and understand how does this workflow behave? What is happening? What happens before that? What happens after? And get a sense of how this thing operates. It also gives you a single point to go and query the state. What is the state of my workflow? Well, there's one component that knows about it, right? That again gives you visibility. So, which one is better? Orchestration? Choreography? Any guesses? Quiet. It's good, because actually I have not enabled you to answer that question yet. Because we have not covered the downsides that a choreographed approach would introduce in our system. And to do that, I want to introduce a completely different use case from the banking domain that would kick off once we say, you know what, I love this house, we found this bank, I'm good with their rate, and this is where we're going to sign. This kicks off a completely different use case inside the bank's domain. And having worked in banking for over 5 years, there's one or two things that I can tell you about how that would look like. So basically what happens is you go into the bank and you say, we're ready to accept this offer. At that point, the bank will do an ID check and a credit scoring check. You might say, hey, the loan broker already did that. Yes, but it's a bank. Trust but verify. That's the attitude, right? Once that's complete, what will happen is that we will sign our documents until your wrist is like, oh my God, how many more of these do we have? And then the first page, you're still trying to pay attention. And by the third, you're just like, well, sign away all of my rights, it's good. But anyway, once those documents are signed, we also want to link the repayment account. From which account are you going to pay off this loan? And it's not as simple as just selecting from a Dropbox, right? Because your account manager will be checking, does that account have funds? Or does it have a sort of influx of funds that ensures that they will get their money every month? Once we have that, then we can create our loan, which also means that we will have to calculate some interest provisions, which are basically, so when you think of the amount that you pay off every month, right, to the bank, part of that is a capital amount and part of it is interest. That interest amount, that's what the bank earns from the mortgage, basically. And what they do with that interest is they calculate part of it and they set it aside. They basically provision it to be able to deal with bad assets or maybe reinvest in another way. And the bank wants to have some insight into how much money they're going to have available at a point in time, so these things are pre-calculated. What we also want to do is set up a direct debit from the account. So they're not going to wait until you wire the money. It's just going to come off your account automatically every month. And then we will also set up a cash payout to the notary. Now, I don't know how it works here in Greece, but in Belgium, when you get a mortgage and you say, okay, 500K, you are never going to see that money on your account, not even for a split second, because it will be wired by the bank to the notary, which is an intermediate party that will oversee that acquisition of the house. And when you get your deed, then basically the notary will take care of paying the people who sold their house. Once you have that deed, you can go back to the bank and say, okay, my deed is finalized, we have the house, and at that point we can start the loan. Let's say that we are going to implement this using a choreographed approach, okay? Now, that could look something like this. So our quoting services publishes that the quote was accepted. At that point, we do our ID check, we do our credit scoring check, and then we will make sure that all our documents are signed. And when that happens, our payment service will react to, schedule that cash payout to the notary. Our provisioning service will do its job, and the banking service will take care that that direct debit is set up for your repayment every month. But this also brings a bunch of downsides. Let's try to consider those for a moment. So first of all, I want to talk a little bit about business failures. And I'm specifically saying business failures and not technical failures, because technical failures, well, what do we do with those? Resilience patterns, right? We want to do retries, we want to do a retry with a back-off mechanism, we want to introduce circuit breakers, and that's how we want to deal with technical failures. It's not something that we expose our users to, ideally. However, with business failures, I'm referring to things that can go wrong on the business level. So basically, like when things don't go as planned. Let's say that I go to the notary, we're super happy to get this house, and the notary is like, well, I am really sorry, but actually the seller's back out. Now what? Who has the money? The bank. So basically that money needs to find its way back, the notary has the money, and that money needs to find its way back to the bank, right? And of course there may be fines and whatever in the picture, but let's just simplify things and say just the money needs to go back to the bank. Now, at that point, what needs to happen is that those interest provisions that we calculated, we're never going to get that money, so we'll have to undo them. That direct debit, well, I'm definitely not going to pay for a mortgage for a house I didn't get, right? I think we can all agree on that. And we may even want to inform our quoting department that, okay, that quote that was accepted, it never really materialized into a loan. Now, what I want you to sort of be aware here is like, how many arrows are you introducing in the reverse order? Let's take a look at that in our design, right? So in this case, what would happen is our payment service would publish an event saying, okay, this money came back, and our loan service subscribes to that, yes? Now, this is where we introduce bidirectional coupling, because previously our payment service was already subscribed to an event coming from loans. And now we're doing the reverse. Loans is subscribing from an event that's coming from payments. Now, at that point, our loan service will publish an event saying this loan was canceled, and our provisioning service, banking service, and even the quoting service can just subscribe to that and deal with that. So this is still a relatively okay example. But if you find yourself in a situation where a compensating or a business failure flow like this makes you introduce 5, 6 levels of bidirectional coupling, well, then you've basically overcomplicated things, and your design is kind of breaking apart at that point because it's not holding up to the change. Now, I like to think of these business failures as compensating flows, things that happen outside of your happy path, so to speak, right? Where you want certain parts of the work that was already done to be undone. I like to also compare this with knitting, which is one of my favorite hobbies, in which, like, sometimes I make mistakes. I mean, it happens. But that doesn't mean that I unravel all of the work and start from the beginning. Not really nice when you're knitting a sweater. So what I will first see, oh, can I pick up a stitch here and then I'm good? Or I will just unravel part of the work. And the same tends to happen in our systems, right? We will just take part of the work that is not relevant anymore and undo that part. So we rarely are in a case where we want to undo the entire flow and basically return to the initial state. That's not likely what is going to happen. But when you think about what is required in order to be able to implement a compensating flow, well, you will usually need the same underlying services that got you here to begin with. So when you think about an orchestrated approach, it was already coupled to all of those services. So undoing things is a lot easier in an orchestrated approach than it is in a choreographed approach, generally speaking. So this is important to keep in the back of your mind when you're designing things. But that's not even all. We could also have passive-aggressive publishers. And I like to explain this one with an analogy because it tends to stick. So my husband is the one who usually cooks at home. I very much appreciate that. So the deal that we have is you cook, I will clean up the kitchen. Fair, right? But I swear there are some of these days where I enter the kitchen and I'm like, dude, what happened here? Like, did you use every pot and pan that we had in the house? Like, it's just exploded. And at that point, what I could say is, you know what? I'm going to publish an event to state that the kitchen is messy. And you could argue that that's a perfectly valid event, right? I mean, it's a state that the system has arrived to, and it's describing a fact. Where's the problem then? Well, it's in my expectations. First of all, I expect my husband to be listening to me, meaning subscribe to the event in this analogy, right? And not only that, I expect him to take action. And not just any action. I don't want him to nod. I want him to get up and help me out, right? Now, and we can all, I think, agree that this type of communication, not really good for your relationships. Well, it's not really good for your systems either. But this type of behavior can creep in when you're using a choreographed approach. Let's take a look at our example. So if we consider that banking service that is subscribed to the document signed event, consider what is happening there. So what's happening is that we'll then set up a direct debit on the account, right? But from a loan service perspective, that is passive-aggressive communication because the loan service needs that direct payment to be set up because otherwise the loan would never progress, we would never get any money, and it would be completely stuck. The service would have no way to continue doing any of its work. Now, when you come across a situation like that, two questions to ask yourself. First of all, if it's so important for loans for that thing to be done, then shouldn't it be part of the loan service boundary to begin with? And if you're like, no, banking is still, it's a completely different subdomain, fine. Then use command-driven communication. Be explicit about what it is that you want and need from another service. Dear husband, please can you come and help me out in the kitchen? Because if then he doesn't respond or is unable to help out for whatever reason, I can deal with the consequences, or he can, depends. So it's just about being explicit about the coupling that you have and make sure it's not hidden, okay? But there are also cases in which we may want to change the workflow. Now, imagine that we have a regulation change and the bank says, well, there's this new requirement from government, and apart from doing an ID check and a credit scoring check, we also want to introduce a background check because we don't like to loan money to criminals. Great, fine. Well, easy, right? I already told you in the beginning, in a choreographed approach, we can just add an event subscription and we're good to go. So we'll just do that and everything is good in the world, right? Not really. Because what happens now is that we need to change loans and make sure it doesn't subscribe to the credit scoring anymore. It needs to wait for the background check to happen. Now, this is also just not great, apart from the fact that you have to change two components to still introduce a single step in the workflow or change a step in the workflow. What we've done here is introduce order coupling. First do the ID check, then the credit scoring, then the background check. Now, I do need my ID check to happen before I can do credit scoring and background check. But no one ever said, from a business perspective, that basically that credit scoring and background check can't happen at the same time. But we've kind of like modeled it this way because then we have an order and just a single event to subscribe to and everything is good in the world. Now you might say, well, Laila, come on, you could just, from the loan service, subscribe to both events, right? And then it's fine. Yes, but imagine what's happening then. Because you have a complex prerequisite, so to speak. You have to wait for the credit scoring and the background check to be done. And you don't know what's going to happen first, which means that you have to keep some state around. And how does that sound like? Sounds a lot like orchestration at that point. Now, I'm not saying that you come across a scenario like this, now you have to go and change the entire flow and make it orchestrated. But it's important to start keeping an eye out for these things to see, are there tiny sub-workflows that I could isolate and where I can make different decisions, okay? Because that's going to be the point. And another thing we need to do is to try to become aware of, is there, like, are we working in a domain that is very sort of prone to change? Is there change coming our way? And the most plausible scenarios that we can think of, how would that look like? Now, one of the things we want to do is find the areas that are most likely to change. And I know that this is an impossible sort of question, right? Because we don't always know what's going to happen. However, there are very good techniques to have a good enough prediction to see if your design or architecture is going to be able to withstand change. Now, one technique I've used over the years is finding anti-requirements. You will find that in my resources in the interest of time, or you can check out Barry O'Reilly's residuality theory, which is also a very interesting approach to basically design your system in a way that it is much more prepared for change in the future. And what you then want to do is the most plausible scenarios, you want to look at them, try to implement them just conceptually, not actually in code, but conceptually in your design and see, does my design still stand? Am I introducing a huge amount of bidirectional coupling? How is the system sort of evolving? How is this standing? Do I need to change how many services to be able to deal with? Would another coordination approach be more useful here? It's important to do this so that at least you are aware of the trade-offs that you are making when you make these types of decisions, because they're not always easy to change. But there's another downside. Actually, there's a few more, but you'll have to ask me about those after a session because I don't have enough time. But there's the lack of overview, right? Now, the thing is that when we use a choreographed approach, there's no single service that we can go to figure out, how does this workflow behave? What's happening? What is first? What is after? In what order do things happen? Or what are more of the complex prerequisites that we have? Because it doesn't exist. Instead, what we have is events that are basically services that are reacting to events. So our workflow emerges from all of those event chains that are happening in the system. Emerging behavior. I always find that a very interesting term in the sense that it sounds very sophisticated and very smart, but really what it means is, I don't really know what the system does. Let me go and execute it for you and I will tell you after, because it's too hard to figure it out from the code, right? And that can sometimes start to feel like a pinball architecture where basically you publish an event in a service and it's like ding, 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 everywhere you see events basically firing off everywhere, but you have really no idea of how these things connect together and what's happening. And that typically leads to friction. What I've seen most friction sort of appearing in teams is, first of all, when you need to understand the state of the workflow. Okay, where are we at? Well, I don't know. Let me go query the 7 services that are involved in this choreography, put all of that state together, reason about it, and I will let you know. Which is especially interesting when there's an issue in production and there's a manager breathing down your neck, right? And you're like, yeah, let me book an event storming session. No, that doesn't work. Your documentation, yeah, completely outdated because we've changed everything. And what I've seen in these sort of environments is that teams start to point fingers at each other. No, we are fine. We have subscribed to that event and we have done this and that, and we've published that, and we're completely fine from our perspective. And every team is saying the same thing. And what happens then? Well, it's quite simple. If nobody's responsible, then everybody is responsible. Nobody goes home. If you're lucky, you get to order pizza and work through the night. Of course, you don't want to find yourself in a situation like this. And a way to mitigate that is to introduce observability in your system. Now, another topic I care a lot about, unfortunately, not enough time to cover that at all, but I do have, again, resources at the end. I've done other talks on the topic, and I have examples and much documentation if you want to learn more, or come and ask me, of course. Now, at this point, you might ask yourself, come on, this is impossible. Like, first you made it sound as if choreography was better, and now you're making it sound as if choreography is horrible. Now, The reality is that no pattern is better than the other, right? A well-architected, well-designed system will have a little bit of both. So really, the answer is it depends. And I know you're now thinking, like, why did I spend 40 hours of my time in this session to then hear it depends? That's not helpful. I know. That's why what I also want to do with you today is share sort of my own sort of framework that I built over the years, which is just like a couple of questions that I will ask myself that will point me into the right direction of choosing the right coordination mechanism. And the first question is, what type of communication is best suited for this type of a workflow? Are there business reasons for which we need synchronous communication or asynchronous communication? And I'm saying business reasons because that should be the thing that is driving you to make these decisions, right? Not technical ones. If you say, asynchronous communication would be better for us, then it is more likely that an orchestrated approach is going to work well for you. And I designed this as a spectrum on purpose. It's not a yes or no bit flag, okay? It is a spectrum. There might be situations in which you want to use synchronous communication and still have a choreographed approach. There are techniques to do that. But if you're like, asynchronous approach is the way to go for us, well, then it could be either orchestration or choreography, and you have to look at the other questions to help you reach an answer. The next question I will ask is, do we have complex prerequisites? Remember the background check and the credit scoring before we can proceed with signing the document? It's a pretty simple prerequisite, but it gives you an idea of a more sort of complex thing where we have to wait until that and that is done. That's what I want to refer to as a prerequisite. If you have many of those, orchestration can really be a helpful approach to deal with that because we will have to keep some state around to be able to split those things apart and not introduce order coupling, as I said. If you don't have any of those or don't have many of them that are important, well, then choreography could still be a good fit for you. The next question I will ask myself is, how many of these complex compensating flows do we have? Remember things that happen outside of the happy path, so to speak? If you think of those and you try to sort of implement them, how many of that bidirectional coupling would that introduce? That's the thing that we are looking for with this question. If you have many compensating flows and they're quite complex or very divergent, well, then an orchestrated approach is just going to be more useful because you already have access to all of those services that participate in the workflow, and you're not going to be introducing additional bidirectional coupling. If you're like, no, I don't have many of them, or they're pretty trivial, then fine. A choreographed approach can still be a very good fit for you. The fourth question is there a high probability of change? And this is not only about a changing domain. It can also just be about how well do you understand the requirements, right? If you come into an environment, you don't have access to business experts, and you don't even really understand what it is that the system needs to do, well, then a choreographed approach is going to hurt you because as your insights progress and things are going to change, then changing a choreographed workflow can be very painful. Can speed you up in the beginning, can be very painful after. So in such a situation, actually orchestrating can be a better approach. And if you're like, no, this is a stable domain, we know what we're doing, we have access to business experts, and this is actually something that is relatively stable and doesn't change in the business either, then choreography can be a very good approach as well. My final question is there someone responsible for the workflow? Now, this is a question that nobody ever asks, but I think this is really, really important. Because if you have a very high sense of responsibility, like this is a business critical workflow, then orchestration gives you visibility into the workflow. It gives you control over the state in a single point without having to coordinate across multiple services and across multiple teams to be able to understand where you are. If that's not the case, then choreography can be a good approach. I'll give you an example of this, right? Everyone knows the retail business. Let's say that we place an order and all of the things that need to happen in order to fulfill that order. You could perfectly design that with choreography. I've seen it, it works pretty well. Amazon does it that way, for example. However, I've seen company after company still go for an orchestrated approach when doing that. And they end up with an orchestrator service called order fulfillment. And the reason is that they want that responsibility assigned to a single team so that if something would go wrong, single point of responsibility. Okay, so that's also very important to ask yourself. My 5 questions, you can find them in the resources, but there's one final thing that I want to basically tell you before you move on, and that is that you have to be mindful of the size of your workflows. If you take a massive workflow and you take these 5 questions, the answer is always going to be orchestration, okay? Because you will have a high sense of responsibility and there will be complex prerequisites and you will possibly need asynchronous communication and you will have complex compensating workflows, flows that are part of your workflow. So it's very important that you try to isolate parts out so that it can enable you to make different decisions for those parts as well. And that brings me to the end, right on time, I think. What I want to give you away is that there is no right or wrong pattern, right? I've heard these fights over the last decade of orchestration or choreography, which sort of side are you on? There is no side. A well-designed, well-architected system will have a little bit of both. The secret sauce is in choosing the appropriate places in which to introduce each, right? It's important that you try to split your workflows apart and identify sub-workflows for which you can make different decisions. And then you can use that 5-question framework. Also important to keep reevaluating your service boundaries and to stay aware of the trade-offs that you are making. I know that we don't have any time for questions, but I'm going to be around for the rest of the day. If you have any questions, please come talk to me. I would love to hear more. There's a bunch of stuff that I left out because it's 40 minutes. So if you want to hear more, definitely come and reach out. Thank you very much.